Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Friday of Native Cultures of North America. It's Anthropology 3-4. It is the 22nd of March. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the struggles and successes of Northeastern Native groups in the modern era. We'll also be talking about the assignments for this week, the discussion board, the quiz, as well as your paper, which is due today. So if you haven't turned in your paper, today's the day. I'm still getting emails from people saying like, oh, I haven't picked a group yet. How about this group? Yeah, if you're still haven't picked a group, now is a great time to pick it. Please do that. Please turn in your papers today. If you can't get them in today, shoot for this weekend. Definitely will be great on like Sunday. So if you can't get it in tonight, tomorrow, please turn that in so we can grade it. You're going to need to do that because you got a PowerPoint coming up a week from today, which is due to get everybody's PowerPoint. Remember, the PowerPoint and the paper instructions for those can both be found on the Canvas website back in week 6. Click here. Remember, when you do your paper, both easier for you as well as for me for grading it, to make sure you have these headings, right? Environment, material, culture, customs, notable members, land, struggles, and successes. When we grade it, we're going to be going down the list. One of the things we were doing is making sure you got stuff in all those categories. We're also going to make sure that you have enough stuff, right? It's 5 to 7 pages, 7 to 10 pages. But if you only have, 2 sentences about notable members and 4 pages about environment, or 6 pages about material culture, and 2 sentences about struggles and successes, even if you hit that 10-page limit, you're still not going to be getting all those parts, right? So make sure you do that. We'll also be grading it based on the rubric in terms of like grammar, punctuation, creative stuff. What else is on there? Critical thinking, cultural relevance, or cultural relativism, that kind of thing. Yeah, you'll be graded. Critical on your knowledge, analytic thinking and content development, intercultural understandings, appreciation, and verbal and nonverbal communications. So we'll grade those on those as well, mostly for assessment. Doesn't really matter for you guys. And then next week, when you go to turn it in your PowerPoint presentation, hopefully the idea is you've already written this paper, so you've already done the research, you've got your sources already, you've already been immersed in the culture. And then when you make your PowerPoint, a good way of doing that is maybe making slides for environment, material culture, customs, notable members, land, struggles, and successes. You're gonna do a 5 to 7 minute talk the week after you turn your PowerPoint in. So make sure you got all those important points. You also want to have at least 1 to 3 visuals on each slide to keep the people entertained. Okay. I think I had 1 person turn it in for the research conference. Okay, any questions about the paper? Perfect. Everybody feel pretty good? Yeah, you should, hopefully. If not, now's the time to get started, right? Okay. What else? We also have discussion board number 6, as well as quiz number 7, discussion board 6. I'm gonna ask you a pretty standard question. What was the most interesting thing you learned about Native Americans in the Northeast, and why was it interesting to you? And then for your quiz this week, you're going to answer questions about Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, Hiawatha, which make sure you watch that video. We'll talk about him. We talked about him a little bit last time, as well as we watched an in-depth video on the social and political organization of the Haudenosaunee. And today we'll talk about recent struggles and successes among Northeast Native people. Okay, so somebody remind me about last time we left off at our video about Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian government. Tell me about Iroquoian government and society. What's it all about? How does their government reflect their society? How about that question? That's a more specific question. Such a hard question. It's walking out. How does Iroquoian government or Haudenosaunee government reflect their society? Kind of, yeah, matriarchal. What does that mean?
key were roles were significant.
Yeah, women, especially those clan mothers, and how did that impact their government?
It was mostly headed by
Yeah, clan mothers, and they would pick their representatives and send them off to debate these issues at the council fire. How about broadly though? How about beyond kind of matriarchal and kind of women having a say in government, which is, you know, something maybe we could learn from in our society? How about the longhouse? How did the longhouse become a metaphor for Iroquois or Haudenosaunee government? Why? How did the longhouse become a model for their governmental system? They call themselves people of the longhouse. Does that carry over to their governmental system? Questions like these might appear on your test. Number 2. So, in many ways, this functions as like a metaphor. They call themselves people of the longhouse. Their society is organized around longhouses, right? These kind of communal family living arrangements where you have different nuclear families brought together. In many ways, the Confederation was thought of as a big longhouse to bring these 5 nations together, right? And they all acted as independent families, but they were united by this common longhouse, right? And the systems of moiety and clan, which kind of cross-cut these Iroquois settlements, get recapitulated on a larger level about which nation, you know, go into which moiety and how they're organized in terms of the council fire, right? The council, the whole Iroquois council, you know, the actual room is set up like a longhouse with a ceremonial fire in the middle. So all these things, right? They take this kind of central metaphor of their culture and they build it into their government. And their government was important. Why? Why is it important to study Iroquois government? Oh, it's so interesting. You know, another Jeopardy question for you. But why? How did that impact maybe our system of governance? Collective council, yeah, right. And some of these ideas of collective representation, checks and balances, right? It all made their way into our government through the founding fathers, and they're kind of being enchanted or being interested in how Iroquois Confederacy was set up, and you know, even these apocryphal stories about Mohawk or Onondaga men kind of going along to the Continental Conference and waiting around upstairs till if anyone has any questions about just exactly how government's supposed to work, they could go pop up and ask. So, definitely influenced kind of the way that we operate in the modern world. Switch this over. Okay, so we'll talk about the modern era a little bit today, right? Unlike some of these, you know, areas which we talked about kind of throughout the semester, and we'll talk about a little bit later, like the West, or like when we talk about the Arctic, or Mesoamerica, places where we see kind of strong presence for native tribes, especially reservations and large tracts of land set aside for indigenous people. In the Northeast, that doesn't happen very much, right? There are kind of the reservations up here in kind of upstate New York area, especially state reservations. There are some reservations in Maine, there's some in Virginia, but in a few little ones, maybe in Connecticut or Massachusetts, but for a large part, a lot of these groups were severely disrupted kind of by European colonization and conquest pretty early on. And so kind of their fate is a little bit different maybe from some of these other tribes, right? Like with maybe the Navajo, who got to kind of stay in place and, you know, have a large reservation. A lot of these groups during this time, some of them, like the Iroquois, did manage to stay in place, right? They were forced off their land, primarily a lot of them to Canada, but some of them returned and kind of set up reservations here. But a lot of these groups were either exterminated pretty early on, they died from disease, or they were pushed west. People like the Delaware and the Shawnee, right? We think of Delaware as like the state of Delaware, right? Well, how do they end up out in the Midwest, right? And then eventually in Oklahoma. Well, they were kind of driven from their homelands multiple times and then kind of put on a reservation. So some of these groups kind of ended up pretty far away from where they started. Other ones are still kind of right here. We're going to take a look at some of those cases today and what's going on with those groups that are up there. There are, like I said, a number of these tribes which have rights. And one of the most, I don't know if it's most important, but one of the kind of the biggest lands claims, right? A lot of what's going on in the region has been trying to reclaim their land, right? A lot of this land was taken away from the tribes pretty early on, settled by colonists, whether, you know, some of it even before America existed, right? Talking about like Massachusetts colony or the Virginia colony and things like that. And so it's this kind of tricky legal precedent where you have tribes that have signed treaties with governments, you know, colonial governments, which maybe don't exist anymore, or signed state government treaties, which, you know, federal government since the 1960s or 70s no longer recognized. Everything has to come through the federal government. And it makes this kind of messy patchwork for trying to reclaim their land. One of the most celebrated, but also kind of problematic Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act is the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act of 1980, in which two Native American groups from the state of Maine, the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy, sued the government for their land back. Right? They said, well, you know, you said we have to like follow these rules, so now we're actually going to like take you to court because you've broken these treaties, you know, which you've made against us. And they actually were able to show proof, and this is Jimmy Carter in 1980, just before the presidential election, signing this large land claim, right? The tribes at one time claimed 2/3 of the state of Maine, right? The government was concerned about that. They weren't just going to give 2/3 of the state of Maine away to these small Native American tribes. So they proposed a financial settlement. And while this was kind of put forward at the time as like, this is going to help your tribe, right? You know, you don't necessarily get your land, but you're going to get some money, right? And this is going to allow you to build schools and roads and, you know, healthcare in your communities. This is going to be great. Because like many other Native tribes, if we've talked about, these were groups that were often, you know, mired in poverty. Why do you think, again, why do you think we didn't hear about this? Why do you think none of you know about this? Do you think they got what they wanted after all? Maybe not, right? So this is a retrospective. This is from 2023, so it's fairly recent. You know, it's only a couple months old. And it's a retrospective from News Center, Maine, where they go and talk to some of the leaders of these tribes today. So this is 42 years later, after the settlement case, which was supposed to, you know, end poverty and end all the problems that the tribe was facing and kind of give them back something to, you know, get them started on this road to the 21st century. So we'll take a look at this video and see how maybe, you know, it's worked out and maybe how it quite hasn't worked out. So remember, for your quiz this week, as well as on your test, if you have questions about modern struggles and successes, and this might be a good reference point for that. All right, so you just watched a video on the 1980 Maine Indians Land Claimed Act. So for the Penobscot or the Passamaquoddy, what are some struggles and successes that you saw in the video? Some things going on in their current life, or the current life of the people of this tribe. The ups and the downs, what do you see?
State governments being in direct control over
right? They are supposed to be sovereign nations, but, you know, they become kind of, they lose sovereignty to the government of Maine, and they end up having to go through these kind of paternalistic relationships of finance and of governance, right? So while the federal government claims that they are fully sovereign, they don't feel like they are, right? And they're kind of hamstrung by this paternalistic colonial relationship still. Anything else, positive or negative? What'd you see? Yeah. Yeah, they made some good investments, some bad investments. I don't know if they got a real good deal out of it, especially when you know, picture 2/3 of the state of Maine for $88 million doesn't quite seem, you know, all of that, all of that for 88 million. I guess millions weren't worth as much back in the day, but still, not a very favorable financial, but it's still good for them, right? They got some money. But again, a lot of this money didn't end up, some of it helped the tribe, gave them some better housing, better educational opportunities, health opportunities, financial dealings. But again, right, money always goes away after a while. And your land is always kind of gone, right? So they never got to reclaim all these lands which they were trying to get, and are trying to figure out the best way to go forward there. Okay, so we talked about land. What's another major kind of issue that often native people today face? Issues of land. What are some of the other modern things that we talk about? This is a transition to the second thing. Healthcare. What else? What are some other major issues? Keep fish until you find the one I'm looking for. What's that? Disease, right? We'll put that with healthcare. There's some other major issues they face today. Water. About cultural issues. I'll direct you in the right direction. What are some cultural issues, right? That groups might face? Erasure, right? Kind of the assimilation, right? This idea that's been since the 1930s or so that, right? Basically the government's being like, well, the Indian stuff's that's old, right? That's all like a long time ago, right? You're modern Americans now, get with the program, right? Move off the res, speak English, get yourself a real job, right? Live in nuclear families, have individual private property, right? You're all Americans now, right? And one of the ways, how might that hurt or damage an indigenous culture, these kind of assimilationist policies from the government? How might that damage your culture if the government's telling you to leave all that stuff behind, get with the times? Yeah, right. There's often the kind of modernizing, often young people are like, yeah, this is great, right? We're gonna make some money, we're gonna do it. And then older people who are often, more traditional, elders especially, are looking to kind of conserve those traditional ways, right? And this can work for a while, but what happens after a few decades of this? What happens to those old people? They're gone, right? They die off. And then there's these cultural traditions often die as well. And so one of the things that we've been kind of looking at throughout the semester is the way that these groups have tried to either save traditions and customs from, being lost or to bring them back. And so we have time, I think, for 2 videos. We'll see if we can get through both of them, or at least through parts of them. We're going to look at 2 ways that Iroquois groups have worked to kind of revitalize their culture. We're going to look at language, which is a major thing across Native cultures. Why might language be important as part of this cultural preservation and revival? Can you just speak English like everybody else? Oral traditions, right? You're trying to learn. A lot of this stuff wasn't written down. It's passed down, has this kind of cultural knowledge and stories and myths and songs and all these things that are not written down in books. Why else? What else does language do beyond just giving you a means to communicate with other people? Yeah, kinship, community, identity, right? We're the people who speak Haudenosaunee, right? We are all Iroquois speakers. So this gives us some kind of identity, right? Even if especially if you've lost a lot of those other markers. Oh, I don't wear buckskin anymore, right? I don't live on the res, or I don't, eat these traditional foods, but I still speak the language, right? It gives me a way to connect with my culture. Just like, any of you grew up in a household maybe where grandma or grandpa spoke a different language, Spanish, Mandarin, German, anything like that, and you as a grandkid can't speak to them, or this language has been lost, you kind of know how this feels, right? So we're going to take a look. The first one of these is about language. It's only about 5 minutes. We'll take a look at it. And the ways that the Seneca, one of those Iroquoian groups, right? These people over here living on Lake Ontario, how they are working to bring back their language after the loss of, at this point, the loss of the last 100% native speakers, people who grew up with it, right? So how do you bring back a language when, second language speakers are pretty much all you have, right? How do you create, especially in the classroom, how do you create these programs to pass along the language to the next generation? Because one of the problems that these language programs always face, right, is the young people are always too cool, right? They don't want to do that. They want to speak English. They want to watch American TV. They want to watch movies and read books in English, right? So how do you make this palatable to the younger generation? So we'll watch this, and then we're going to talk about sports for our last topic of the day after this. All right, so you just watched a video on Seneca's speakers working to bring back their nearly erased languages. Tell me some of the struggles and successes that you saw in that video. What's going well and what's maybe a challenge that they face? Yeah, right. Because a lot of the native speakers or the first language speakers aren't around anymore. And we see this in Maya too, right? When Jose and I were taking Maya classes, we always like to talk about like how do they actually go around making new words, right? How do you make a word for a cell phone when you live in, a society or a language where the language was written down and in many cases, isn't evolving. And so you have these people, language activists, often like the guy you saw in the video, trying to modernize these languages, right? How do we talk about cars? How do we talk about DVD players and VCRs and cell phones and all these modern things that we have within a tribal language, right? And why is that important, especially for young people? Why is it important that you be able to talk about the modern world? Was that? That's where we're living, right? And if you can't, then the language is, oh, it's interesting. It lets me talk to grandma, lets me hear these cool myths and stories, but it's not really relevant in my daily life, right? So trying to make it relevant so people use this not only as oh, it's my culture, but also as language of business, a language of church, as a language of government, things like that, right? Trying to make it more widespread in these communities. And you also you heard a little bit about the economic problems as well, people leaving, feeling like, oh, language and culture isn't gonna get me a job, put food on the table. But at the same time, you're losing this important part of who you are in the process, right? So trying to make it so people don't have to choose being, good member of their culture or society and being able to feed their kids, right? We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to show you, we'll look a little bit of this before we go. We probably won't make it through the whole thing. I don't think we have time. One of the other things that's really important, which I think is interesting for a lot of people here at Eastern as well, is this idea of sports, right? And this idea of sports as culturally important. How might we think of sports oftentimes in society as diversion or pastime, or oh, I used to play sports in elementary school, or oh, I watch football on Sundays. But why might sports be an important part of bringing back or preserving indigenous native culture? Seems kind of yeah, sports, right? I mean, it's not like your land or your language or something. It's just sports. It's just games and fun. But why might this be important as well? Yeah, cultural pillar. Oftentimes these games are not just fun and games, right? They often have religious or spiritual significance. They talk about how you're supposed to relate to the world and things like that. What else? Brings community together, right? You create this sense of pride and being part of this community, right? So one of the most important sports among Native Americans is lacrosse. Right? This is a French word, actually. Or the staff they use. This is modern kind of collegiate lacrosse. There's two versions. There's outdoor, and then there's indoor, what's called box lacrosse. It's like you play it on a, ice hockey rink in the summer. And one of the main areas, or one of the best teams in the world, are the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois lacrosse team. And in 2000, 2016, maybe 2015. They actually had the World Box Lacrosse Championship in Iroquois country, right? For the first time they held, I think it's the first time ever, an international sporting competition on native territory. And this is actually really important because the Iroquois have competed for a long time, and they actually, had this issue a couple of years before this, where they actually went to an international championship, but the British government wouldn't let them in because they didn't recognize those passports as legitimate. They were Indian passports. They weren't like national passports, right? So instead, they decided to have the World Championship on Iroquois Nation, right? So they didn't have to travel. So this is a video about some of the athletes who are participating, as well as there's a really interesting thing with a traditional stick maker. So you can kind of see how not only the sport is important, but actually creating the equipment and comes out of this cultural tradition as well. So as you keep the sport alive and bring it back among the youth, you create pride, you create interest in your culture, right? These are the people who created lacrosse, and this was kind of the basis for the modern sport today. So it's all kind of wrapped up together in this movement of cultural preservation. So we'll watch a little bit of this before we go. And again, think of those same questions, struggles and successes. What's up though? All right, so sports, why is it important? Why is it important for cultural preservation among Native American groups like the Haudenosaunee? Is it just fun and games? Yeah, it's way of life, right? You got the guy at the beginning. There's a little bit more of him later, talking about him as like the stick making guru of the Iroquois. He makes all these natural wooden sticks, right? He says it's not just games, right? It's part of our spirituality, our culture, it's in our myths, it's in our kinship, right? It's in all these different parts, and it's a part of our identity. It's who we are, right? And you have one of the players talking about how as soon as you can walk in this culture, boys are given a lacrosse stick, and then you're told, this is like how you become part of your culture and how you express your culture, right? And so by preserving these traditions, by bringing them back and keeping them going, just like the language, right? This is something to kind of fight against these assimilationist policies and create a sense of cultural distinctiveness and continuity with the ancestors. There's a lot more of all that stuff you can check out on Canvas, but we are out of time for today. Next week, we're going to be doing the Great Basin, which is that area of Utah and Nevada. But before we go, I'm going to take attendance. So if you're here, please say hi.